Sir Desmond, a very good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining me. I'm sorry to be so critical of Boris Johnson, a man who I thought was going to be a great Prime Minister of this country, but who I'm afraid at this point in history is turning out to be something of a dud.
Well, I was actually a little bit more encouraged by what happened yesterday, or more particularly what we've discovered this morning. We've discovered this morning that actually Boris has resisted the scientists. They were demanding a full lockdown a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
And resistance is beginning to build. He said, no, we discovered at the weekend that the Irish government, again, were told by their scientists that they had to have an immediate lockdown. And they said, no. We've seen that the World Health Organization is now backing off lockdowns and coming, moving towards the Great Barrington Declaration. So the resistance is building. But to deal specifically with the point that you raised about trust in government statistics, I think that the chief scientist and chief medical officer did huge damage a couple of weeks ago when they produced that graph. He said it isn't a prediction, it's only a possibility. Well, we're nowhere near that possibility on yesterday's statistics. And actually, the other thing that we were told was, nevertheless, if you look at the curve, we're doing much worse than France and Spain were a couple of weeks ago. We're going much higher than they are. Hold on a minute. Coronavirus is like any other commodity. The more you pay for it, the more you will have of it. And we've paid a shed load for a testing and tracing system, £12 billion. We are doing more testing than France and Spain put together. Obviously, we will therefore turn up more cases because we're doing more testing. The second point, the point that you make about the hospital occupation, immediately I was told this. I thought, so what's that got to do with the price of fish now?
Yeah.
The reality is, when we went into lockdown in March, it was not because of the incidence of people being admitted to hospital. It was because the government saw the modelling from the Imperial College, which said 250,000 of us were going to die. It was not the issue that led to the lockdown, and therefore a comparison should not be made saying, oh, we need to contemplate lockdowns now because the hospital admissions are higher. It's a non sequitur.
Yes, I agree with that. But also their use of statistics to try and convince us of the veracity of what they're about to do, I'm getting very fed up with, Desmond, because it turns out that, one of the things that they said yesterday was that we are close to or taking over and exceeding the numbers of people who were in hospital for COVID in March. Now, I can't remember how many people were in hospital in March, but they haven't given us a number in the same way that they give us all these ridiculous statistics about how, percentage-wise, we're getting more and more people into hospitals. We need numbers, and the fact is that we don't trust the government anymore. That's the problem.
I think this, I certainly come back to the point that I made, that I think a lot of trust, certainly for people like me, was lost when we saw the graph that was produced a couple of weeks ago. You've got to be very careful with these things. Statistics, and damn lies are not far from one another. It depends entirely how you present them. You've got to be sure that you're comparing like with like, not comparing apples and pears. And even Van Damme admitted that, or drew attention to it yesterday. And you've got to be very careful when you look at these graphs, exactly what the scales are on the two axes to work out what you're being told.
Well, exactly right. But also, a couple of weeks ago, Sir Desmond, you called for the resignations, or the firings even, of Messrs Valence and Whitty. Do you still call for that?
I agree. I think they went well beyond their brief in what, in my view, was an attempt to scare us, as if people aren't already scared enough. And I think that the statistical analysis that they produced was, frankly ridiculous. And so I stick by what I said.
Yes, and I think they have done untold harm to Boris Johnson, because I get questioned all the time, what else should the government do? Many people are disillusioned with Boris, many people are disillusioned by this government, but actually I blame the scientists for leading him astray.
Well, I agree. But remember, the job of the politician is to sit above the scientists. The scientists are specialists in their particular branch of science. And they will have a set of advice that is focused explicitly on dealing with the disease. The government has to consider the consequences for the economy and the consequences for other diseases being treated by the NHS as well. They have to look at a broader picture. Now, I'm glad that actually Boris has been pushing back and has already, from we've seen from the minutes of Sage this morning, has already rejected the advice that he was given a couple of weeks ago, saying that he needed to go for another national lockdown. So I hope that that resistance will build.
Yes, well, let's hope so. But what about Parliament itself, Sir Desmond? Because we were told there was going to be a vote on the 10 p.m. curfew. I think that was meant to be yesterday. I'm told it may now be today. There was supposed to be a vote on the Graham Brady amendment. That was kind of swept aside. There was supposed to be a vote on the coronavirus bill, which would maybe lessen the government's grip on their ability to do whatever the hell they want to do. But all of that has kind of fallen away. I mean, what are you guys doing to protect the reputations and the businesses of this country?
Well, we did have a vote on the renewal of the powers in the coronavirus bill, and I think I was one of 7 that voted against it.
Yeah.
We will have a vote tonight on the 10 p.m. rule, as well as a whole raft of other government orders basically setting out what they announced last night. Whether we will get those votes individually or whether as a job lot is something that's under discussion now, and some people are very worried about. Frankly, I don't care. If I get to vote against them all in one job lot, that's convenient for me, rather than to have to take them all individually. I can't actually see that there's a terribly big issue there.
Well, there's a big issue for an awful lot of restaurants who can't actually make any money because they have to throw everybody out at 10 o'clock. So I think you guys, and I appreciate that you're one of the standout MPs, Desmond, who has actually voted against the government here. But I think it's your duty bound to try and get this 10 p.m. curfew reversed because there's clearly no scientific basis for it.
I agree entirely. I think it's a disaster, and in fact, the whole notion of the fact that there's no drinking up time, so everybody crashes out at 10 o'clock together, making nonsense of social distancing. Equally, you would be much better to have delegated that power right down to local authorities, so that they could impose a curfew on an individual establishment if there was a problem there, and that would then give the proprietor a huge incentive to influence and control the social distancing behaviour of his patrons. But this national imposition, I agree, has no scientific basis at all. It is just a thorough irritant and increases this general perception of fear and disaster.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. So in terms of the general kind of overview, Sir Desmond, of what we should be doing, I take it that you, like me, think that we are really being far too reliant upon the so-called medical evidence, and we are being far too kind of desperate to try and stop something that we cannot stop. I had a Tory MP on here yesterday who said, look, the government does not control the virus, and it doesn't. But you wouldn't expect them to control the virus because the virus is pretty much uncontrollable by government. So therefore, should we not be much more careful about people who need treatment for other ailments in the NHS, and also people's livelihoods, people's businesses, and people's ability to go to work?
Well, I agree. And I'm not one of those people who says you shouldn't listen to the science. It depends what science you're listening to.
Well, exactly.
There's an awful lot of scientists who are saying something very different. And I've signed the Great Barrington Declaration, signed by so many scientists and clinicians. And that's exactly the point. We should be relying on test, track and trace to try and confine people who are infected so they aren't going out spreading it. But beyond that, you need to concentrate your efforts on providing protection for those people who really need it, including people who are in the NHS. And the rest of us need to take a mature estimate of the risks that we're prepared to take in our ordinary lives in the same way that we do when we encounter any other danger and difficulty like crossing the road.
Right.
And concentrate on the fact that actually this is only 24th in the league of killers in the United Kingdom today, killing only 1.4 of us. So, we need to have a mature attitude to the economic realities of getting on with our normal lives, because this could go on forever.
Well, exactly.
There is no guarantee that there will be a vaccine.
And aren't you concerned as well, Sir Desmond, that I know 4 years seems a long way off, but when the next general election comes around, if this has not been sorted out, there will be many people in the northern seats that the Tories won in the last election in December who will just desert the Tories once more. I don't know who the hell they're going to vote for, but they're certainly not going to vote for Boris Johnson.
Well, my attitude was, clearly there's a danger. I hope not. And I hope when it comes to an election, you remember you're always comparing the alternatives and hanging on to nurse for fear of something worse. And it's interesting to see the Labour Party's reaction this morning to the news that 2 weeks ago the scientists were demanding a full lockdown. Their reaction is, well, why haven't you done it? I mean, so actually, I'm quite confident that were we under a Labour government, the measures being imposed on us would be significantly worse. At least Boris is holding a line. I want him to move the line in my direction.
Okay, so you're confident that Boris is back. Is that what you're telling me?
I certainly, a couple of times, I've listened to Boris a couple of weeks ago at the 1922 committee, and he was full of beans. He was the old Boris again. But then yesterday we were back in this terrible Project Fear. I can't get over it, but there it is. I hope that the resistance, even within Boris's own mind, is building.
Yes. Well, let's hope so.